There are several ebooks languishing in my Kindle queue. More than several, probably. But that's all I'm willing to admit right now. But the two that are weighing on me most heavily are Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Tatum, and I Am Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. I bought them, and I'm excited, and I know I need to read them, but I also haven't read them because I realized I needed to do something first. So this Lent, I've been slowly working through Layla Said's Me and White Supremacy workbook. The workbook is an unflinching and vital piece, as it starkly lays out definitions of white supremacy and white exceptionalism and white fragility and all of the unexamined places of racism that I have been functioning in for so long that I stopped being conscious of it. It's been a reminder of what sociologist Robin DiAngelo says in her new book, White Fragility. I believe, she says, that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. Not only do these people fail to see their complicity in racism and white supremacy, but they take a self-serving approach to ongoing anti-racism efforts. To the degree that white progressives think we have arrived, we will put our energy into making sure that others see us as having arrived. You see, for me, before I can truly receive the necessary and good pain of Tatum and Channing Brown's work, I have to admit that I have been very often doing harm to people of color around me because I have been publicly celebrating the ways I'm better than those other white people. I have to do confessional work first, of admitting how much of my anti-racism work has been self-serving. But who actually likes doing confessional work? I can tell you I have not been enjoying it. Since the beginning of the year, we have covered 3 spiritual disciplines: prayer, simplicity, and we just finished fasting. And when I chose to bookend the Lenten season with fasting and confession, I assumed they would be the simplest and the most easy to find meaning in, but preparing for today was a reminder of how uncomfortable I and many within the disciples' tradition are with the idea of public confession of sin. Growing up in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, I rarely heard a sermon about sin or confession. I honestly sound fairly conservative in many circles because of how often I talk about it, even though we have a rainbow on the church. I think it's because, like many of the churches that I grew up in, had membership that was made up of people who had come from denominations where all they heard were sermons about sin and confession. So we heard a lot of sermons about grace and forgiveness, which are really nice, but grace and forgiveness are only terms that have meaning if they're paired with sin and confession. Because you don't need grace unless you sinned. You don't confess unless there's something to confess for. So I was thankful for Richard Foster's insightful description on some of the difficulty of confession for many Christians. He wrote in Celebration of Discipline, confession is a difficult discipline for us because we all too often view the believing community as a fellowship of saints before we see it as a fellowship of sinners. We feel that everyone else has advanced so far into holiness that we are isolated and alone in our sin. We cannot bear to reveal our failures and our shortcomings to others. We imagine that we are the only ones who have not stepped onto the high road of heaven. And therefore we hide ourselves from one another and live in veiled lies and in hypocrisies. But if we knew that the people of God are first a fellowship of sinners, we are freed to hear the unconditional call of God's love to confess our needs openly before one another. We know we are not alone in our sin. The fear and pride that cling to us like barnacles also cling to others. We are sinners together. And in acts of mutual confession, we release the power that heals us. Our humanity is no longer denied. It is transformed. I mean, that sounds good, right? Except I'm still that person who would much rather tell you about my successes than ruminate on all of my failures. I'd like to show you how well I'm doing, why I am better than those other people, those other ministers, instead of admitting to you that I am in just as a great need of God's forgiveness as the ones I consider my enemies. Which is why I'm glad that Jesus tells a parable about confession. Parables are not things that actually happened, okay? They're stories, they're riddles, they're moral tales, they're complicated. But a lot of times Jesus begins them with the kingdom of heaven is like this, which is basically the Jesus equivalent of once upon a time. So, once upon a time, Jesus said, 2 men went to church. One man was a Pharisee, and unlike what you've been told probably, Pharisees were not bad guys. They were not. In fact, they were often very, very good guys. The Sadducees, now they were in bed with Rome. They were colluding against their people for the sake of power. But the Pharisees, they were devout, and they were dedicated, and they were fervent and sincere defenders of their faith. It would have been so easy for the people of Israel, conquered as they were, to lose hold of their faith practices and their stories, but the Pharisees helped them hold on, helped them remember the traditions that Moses had given them. Pharisees, they fasted twice a week, they tithed, they gave 10% of their wealth away. Pharisees were the church members you hope for, okay? One man, though, was a tax collector. Would you like to learn about first century taxes in Rome? It's a lot like debt collecting now. In the first century of Rome, collected taxes was a lot like debt collecting. You know how debt collectors in the United States buy up debt and then try to get it out of you? That's how taxes were collected in Rome. The Roman government would sell the taxes that were due to collectors who would then seek to recoup their losses by collecting the taxes owed to Rome. So they had to cover their losses, and they would seek to collect more than was actually originally owned so they could make money. You know, capitalism. Many times the tax collectors were Jewish themselves, and they were considered collaborators with oppressors, and they were hated by their own people. Tax collectors weren't precisely known for their faithfulness because they were collecting interest, and that was against the Torah. They weren't known to be properly religious, and if you were going to make an assumption, you would assume that the tax collector would be the one who used and despised others. I mean, can debt buyers actually be good church members? Once upon a time, Jesus said, 2 men went to church. One was a member in good standing, and one was a predatory debt collector. And they both started to pray. It would be easy to misjudge the Pharisee's prayer as offensive, but our Pharisee actually seems to be praying a version of Psalm 17. If you test me, you will find no wickedness in me. My mouth does not transgress. As for what others do, by the words of your lips I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths, and my feet have not slipped. It's not wrong to say thank you to God for all the ways that God has helped you avoid terrible paths. And how many times have you witnessed the sinful folly of somebody else's life and thought to yourself, I am so glad that is not my life? If you grew up in a pious church, you might have heard church ladies say something like, "There but the grace of God go I." It's a really passive-aggressive way of saying, "I'm glad I'm not them." That's kind of why I used to watch Grey's Anatomy, so I could feel better about myself and the choices I was making, because everybody on that show makes bad choices all the time. Jesus' listeners of this parable, some of whom are Pharisees, are probably still cheering for the Pharisee even after hearing that prayer. But the tax collector, he seems to be praying something that sounds a lot like Psalm 51. "Have mercy on me, God. According to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my sins." If you're expecting a tax collector to conform to your prejudgments of him, this is a surprising turn of events. Is this cheater actually admitting he's made a mistake? It's about time. And then Jesus does what he so often does in a parable, says something really upsetting to everybody who's listening. Once upon a time, Jesus said there were two men who went to church, and one was a member in good standing, and one was a predatory debt collector, and they were both overheard praying, and only one of those men went home righteous towards God, the predatory debt collector. How can that be? Because the Pharisee's living a good life, and the debt collector's not. That's because they're both confessing sins, right? But the Pharisee isn't confessing his own. He's confessing his neighbor's. His prayer is seeking to remind God of the failures and the sins of other people, like those tax collectors. And the Pharisee seems to believe that he has moved beyond the need to confess his own sin, as if all of this righteous living means he can't possibly be doing anything wrong. But the tax collector, though, in the presence of God, is grieved at who he has become. He is not interested in comparing himself to anyone else, for lifting himself up and his esteem on the necks of the worse off. His prayer is simple and it is moving. Help me, God. I have messed up. And you know, God can work with that. Friends, we know the world is messed up, don't we? And we know it is messed up because of the people who live in it. And when we finally tell the truth about ourselves, we will admit that we are some of those people. But we're so averse to admitting our failures. I'm not racist. I'm not like them. That's still just as popular a refrain now as it was for Pharisees in Jesus' day. But our comparative Olympics, our need to be seen as on the right side of history, keep us from doing the simple and healing act of confessing like that tax collector did so many years ago. When I stop being fragile and start confessing that I am still daily battling the instincts of racism and white supremacy, I do less harm to people of color, and I can begin to be a part of healing and justice, but not till then. When I stop turning a blind eye to the consequences of my daily living, and I will do less harm to the environment and begin to be a part of the healing of creation, when I stop lying about how I am still complicit in structures that marginalize LGBTQ people, I can become a part of the people that fight those structures down. But confession is the beginning of that. And confession is never defensive. It is never concerned with counting the sins of somebody else before you speak about your own. God doesn't need me to tell God about what my neighbor's doing. Confession admits that grace and forgiveness are necessary for us to transform and to do good, and that grace and forgiveness comes freely from the very hands of God. So this week, I want you to lay aside your need to show off about how woke you are, or about how just you are, or about how good you are. And at least twice this week, I want you to bravely experience the love of God when you finally admit that you have failed and that you need forgiveness. Maybe you will do this in the midst of prayer. Maybe you will talk to God out loud in your car. Maybe you will be on a walk in nature and you will let go of your defensiveness and you will face your mistakes. I don't know where you'll be when I hope you do this. But I want you to not worry, because this church is a communion of sinner saints, all who have fallen short of God's ideal for our lives. Everyone. We, all of us, are more grieving debt collector than proud Pharisee. And admitting that is how we begin to heal. Lent is almost over. We march onward to Jerusalem, to the terrible and beautiful events that will culminate in an empty tomb. So as we make these last few weeks there, let us take time to confess, to reorient our lives away from pride and accomplishment and towards the healing love we know we need. Once upon a time, Jesus said, 2 men went to church. Now, there are at least 2 of us here today. So when you hear this parable, I hope that you are more tax collector and less Pharisee.